My name is Margaret Hill. I'm 78 years old, and I have lived in this small town in Pennsylvania my entire life. I'm a widow of a decorated war veteran, Thomas Hill, a man who gave more to this country than most people will ever understand. For decades, our home was filled with his stories, his laughter, and the quiet pride that came with his service. His war medals weren't just shiny pieces of metal. They were his blood, sweat, and tears, his courage immortalized in brass and silver. I kept them safe in a glass case in the living room, dusting them gently every Sunday, whispering to him, as if he could hear me, "I'm taking care of your legacy, Tom." But that legacy, my sons treated it like trash. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those clear but cold days where the air is sharp enough to sting your cheeks. I'd been out back, hanging laundry on the line, when I heard the sound of a car pulling away from the driveway. I didn't think much of it until I walked inside and noticed the display case was gone. Not moved.
Gone.
My heart dropped, my knees buckled, and I called out for my eldest son, Peter, thinking maybe they had moved it for cleaning. But when I found both Peter and my younger son, David, sitting in the kitchen sipping coffee like nothing was wrong, the truth hit me like a brick to the chest. "Where are your father's medals?" I demanded, my voice trembling, though I tried to keep it steady. Peter didn't even look up from his mug. "Oh, that? We sold them. Got $10 for the whole lot." I felt the air leave my lungs. $10. $10 for a lifetime of service, for the ribbons he'd earned crawling through mud, the medals he'd bled for, the ones I clutched to my chest the day they folded the flag over his coffin. My hands shook so violently I had to grip the counter just to keep standing. David leaned back in his chair and shrugged. "They were just junk from the past, Mom. Nobody wants that old stuff anymore. It was just collecting dust. Junk from the past." That's what my sons called the only tangible reminder of the man who'd built this family, the man who'd taught them to ride their bikes, who'd spent nights working overtime so they could have Christmas presents. I could feel a heat rising in my chest, not the warmth of love, but the fire of betrayal. I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything. I just stood there, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out every other sound. And as I stared at them, sipping their coffee like nothing had happened, something inside me shifted. I remembered something they had both clearly forgotten: the deed to the house and land they were sitting in, the one they assumed was in their names, was still mine. I excused myself quietly, went to my bedroom, and opened the old cedar box in my closet. There it was, crisp and official, with my name in bold letters. My pulse steadied. They had taken something irreplaceable from me, but they had no idea the power I still held in my hands. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding that paper, and a plan began to form, slow, deliberate, and cold. They thought they had stripped me of everything. But this was my ace. And I wasn't going to waste it. The question was, how do you teach your own children the weight of what they've destroyed? How do you make them feel the same sting they just left in your chest? I knew one thing. When I was done, they'd never call their father's legacy junk again. But first, I needed to make them believe I was powerless. And that meant playing along. I took a deep breath, folded the deed back into the box, and walked into the kitchen with a calmness that must have made me look like I'd given up. Peter smirked. David glanced at each other with that silent exchange only brothers can share, the one that says she's not going to do anything. Oh, but they had no idea what was coming. And when I was done, they'd wish they had never touched those medals. If you think this was already bad, you have no idea how deep this betrayal goes, and the lengths I was about to go to for justice. To everyone listening right now, what would you have done if it were you? Stay tuned, because in the next chapter, you'll see just how far I was willing to go to make my sons regret crossing me. If you're ready for the rest of this story, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. For the next few days, I played the part of the quiet, heartbroken old woman. I moved around the house slowly, barely speaking unless spoken to, my hands folded in my lap like I had given up. Peter and David barely noticed. They were too busy planning whatever nonsense they always schemed together. I heard whispers about fixing up the place and making changes to their property. That last part made my lips curl into a smile they couldn't see. They had no idea the land beneath their feet, the very walls they were leaning against, were still mine. The deed was in my name, and I had kept every tax payment up to date. If they'd done even a sliver of research before selling off their father's metals, they would have known they had no legal claim. But arrogance is a funny thing. It blinds you. And I was going to use that blindness to my advantage. I started small. I let them believe I had stopped caring about the house. I pretended to be confused about where my own papers were. I misplaced my purse in the kitchen and acted like I couldn't remember where I left it. David made a joke about me getting old and forgetful, and Peter laughed so hard he had to set down his beer. It hurt to hear my own children mock me, but every laugh was a nail in the coffin of the little illusion I was building. One afternoon, I heard them in the living room, voices low but not low enough. "We could get at least $100 grand for the place if we sell it fast," Peter said. David grunted in agreement. "She'll probably sign whatever we put in front of her. Old people do that." I froze just outside the door, my hands curling into fists. They weren't just thinking about selling my home, they were making plans to trick me into signing it away. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at my desk with a cup of chamomile tea, the deed spread out in front of me. I thought about Thomas, what he would have said if he were here. I could almost hear his voice. "Maggie, you don't let anyone, not even blood, trample your dignity." He'd fought wars overseas. I was about to fight one in my own living room. The next morning, I called my lawyer, an old friend named Mr. Harlan who had handled our family affairs for decades. When I told him what happened, his silence said everything. "They sold his metals for $10? He finally said, his voice low and sharp. "Yes," I replied. "And now they think they're going to sell the house. Then we make sure they can't. We can put legal protections in place immediately. If they try anything, they'll be the ones getting eviction notices." I agreed. But I told him not to make any moves yet, not until I gave the word. I wanted my sons to walk right up to the edge of the cliff before I pulled the ground out from under them. The days passed, and my act became almost effortless. I let them talk openly in front of me, pretending I didn't understand. I cooked them dinner. I smiled politely. I even nodded when they mentioned finding a realtor friend. Every time I went back to my room, opened that cedar box, and reminded myself why I was doing this. One Saturday morning, Peter came into the kitchen with a smug grin. "Mom, we've got a guy coming over tomorrow. He's going to take a look at the house and give us a number. Just sign the papers when we give them to you, all right?" I stared at him for a moment, letting my face crumple into a small, pitiful smile. "Of course, dear. I trust you boys." He patted my shoulder like I was some helpless old lady. If only he knew. That night, I went to bed with the deed tucked under my pillow, my heart pounding. Tomorrow, their guy would come. And tomorrow, I'd make my first move. I didn't know exactly how far they were willing to go, but I was ready to match them step for step. And when the truth came out, it would not be quiet. It would hit them like a thunderclap. Because what they thought was theirs was never theirs to begin with. And tomorrow, I'd start showing them just how big a mistake they had made. If you were in my shoes, would you confront them outright or let them hang themselves with their own rope? The choice I made will shock you. Don't miss the next chapter. Like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Sunday morning came with the kind of stillness that feels like a warning. I was up before the sun, brewing coffee in the kitchen and staring out the window, watching the frost melt off the grass. My sons slept in, oblivious to the fact that this was the day the first crack in their plan would appear. By mid-morning, I heard footsteps upstairs and the sound of the shower running. Peter came down first, wearing a pressed shirt like he was trying to impress someone. David followed, holding a folder under his arm. I knew that folder. I'd seen it sitting on the desk in the den earlier that week. It held papers they wanted me to sign, already marked with sticky notes where my signature was required. "Mom," Peter said with a bright smile that didn't reach his eyes, "our guy will be here in about 20 minutes. He's just going to take a quick look around, give us some numbers." I nodded and poured him coffee, my hand steady. "That sounds fine, dear. I said, keeping my voice calm, my eyes soft. I could almost feel their relief, thinking I was already in the palm of their hands. At exactly 11 o'clock, a tall man in a gray suit knocked on the door. He introduced himself as Brian, a real estate appraiser, helping the boys out. He shook my hand politely, though his eyes flicked around the house, as if I weren't there at all. "Mrs. Hill," he said, "I'll just be taking some photos and measurements for the potential sale." Potential sale. The word sat in the air like smoke. I smiled sweetly. "Of course, take your time." He wandered through the living room, his camera clicking. When he reached the empty spot where my husband's medals had once been displayed, he tilted his head. "Used to be something here?" he asked casually. I swallowed. "Yes. My husband's war medals. But my sons decided they weren't worth keeping." Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, before he went back to snapping photos. I tucked that reaction away for later. You never know when someone else's doubt might become useful. After about 30 minutes, Brian sat at the dining table with Peter and David, flipping open his laptop. "It's a great property," he said. "If we move quickly, we could get a strong offer. All we need is your mom's signature here to get the listing agreement started." Peter slid the folder toward me, the pen already uncapped. "Just sign here, Mom. It's all standard stuff." I picked up the pen, my hand hovering over the paper. Then I looked up at them with what I hoped was just the right mix of confusion and trust. "This means I'd get to live here still, right?" Peter smiled tightly. "Of course, Mom." David shifted in his seat, avoiding my eyes. My gut told me he was the weaker link. If I pushed, he'd slip. So I pushed. "It's just this is still my home. My name is still on the papers, isn't it?" David froze. Peter shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. "Mom, don't worry about all that. Just sign." I leaned back, setting the pen down slowly. "You boys know I've kept every document safe all these years. Every single one. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings." Peter's jaw tightened. David cleared his throat. Brian looked from one to the other, sensing tension, but saying nothing. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I smiled again and said, "Let me think about it. I'm not ready to sign anything today." Peter's voice dropped, his smile gone. "Mom, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly." I cut in, my tone firmer than it had been in weeks. "And I'll let you know when I'm ready." The room went still. They didn't push further, but the air between us was heavy. Brian excused himself quickly, clearly wanting no part of whatever was happening here. After he left, Peter slammed the folder shut. "You're making this harder than it has to be." I met his glare without flinching. "And you're making a mistake bigger than you realize." That night, I pulled the deed out of the cedar box again, tracing the letters of my name with my finger. They were getting desperate now, I could feel it. And desperate people make mistakes. I just had to be ready to strike when they did. And I knew that moment was coming faster than they thought. Because what they were about to do next would give me the perfect excuse to take everything back. 2 days after the appraiser left, the air in the house was different. Peter was barely speaking to me, and when he did, his words were clipped. David avoided me altogether. I could tell they were working something out behind closed doors, and I wasn't naive enough to think it was in my favor. That morning, I overheard them in the den. The door wasn't fully closed, and their voices carried. "We just need her signature," Peter hissed. "If she won't give it willingly, we make it happen." David sounded uneasy. "You mean forge it? Do you want the money or not?" Peter snapped. "We've wasted enough time." I stepped away quietly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Forge my signature? That was crossing a line I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about my dignity, my rights, my very identity. That evening, they were unusually polite at dinner. Too polite. Peter asked about my day. David offered to help with the dishes. It would have been touching if I didn't know they were snakes trying to slither close enough to strike. When I went to bed, I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, thinking about all the sacrifices Thomas and I had made for these boys. The nights we went without so they could have new shoes for school, the college tuition we scraped together by selling our second car, the endless hours of love and care. And now, this. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I called Mr. Harlan, my lawyer, and told him everything. "They're planning to forge your signature?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled anger.
"Yes."
"I'm certain of it." He exhaled slowly. "Then we're done waiting. I'll prepare the paperwork to secure your property completely. And Maggie, I'll also prepare something else." "What?" I asked. "An eviction notice. Just in case they push you too far." The thought of evicting my own sons made my chest ache. But that ache was quickly replaced by the cold reminder of their betrayal. Later that day, I found Peter in the kitchen, scribbling something on a sheet of paper. He looked up too quickly when I walked in, his hand sliding the paper into a folder. David walked in a minute later, his eyes darting between us. "You're up early," Peter said, his voice light but strained. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, keeping my gaze on him. That night, I decided to test them. I left my checkbook on the counter, a little bait. Sure enough, the next morning, it had been moved, and one of the pages was torn slightly at the corner, as if someone had tried to copy my signature. I felt the first real surge of anger I'd allowed myself since the medals were sold. This wasn't going to be a slow game anymore. It was time to tighten the noose. I called Mr. Harlan again and gave him the green light. "Do it," I told him. "Make sure my name is ironclad on every inch of this property. And get that notice ready." 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at my door. I opened it alone in my bedroom. Inside were the legal documents securing my ownership and the eviction notice, folded neatly on top. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the sheer power of the moment. The paper felt heavy in my hands, like the weight of justice itself. All I had to do was decide when to use it. I didn't have to wait long. That night, Peter and David sat me down at the dining table with that same folder they'd been guarding. "Mom," Peter began, "we've drawn up the agreement. You just need to sign here." When I opened it, I nearly laughed. They hadn't even tried to hide the fact that it transferred ownership directly to them. I closed it slowly and looked each of them in the eye. "Boys," I said softly, "I think it's time we had a very different conversation." And with that, I reached into my bag and pulled out the one piece of paper that was about to change everything. I laid the paper down on the dining table with slow, deliberate movements. Peter's eyes narrowed immediately, his mouth twitching in irritation. David leaned forward, curious but cautious. They expected me to crumble under their pressure, to hand them my signature like some obedient servant. But what I placed between us wasn't their fraudulent contract. It was the eviction notice. "What's this supposed to be?" Peter scoffed, picking it up and scanning the text. His face went pale halfway through reading. David took it from him, his brow furrowing as he read the words out loud. "Eviction, 30 days to vacate the premises," he trailed off, looking up at me like he couldn't decide whether to laugh or panic. "That's right," I said, my voice steady. 30 days. This is still my house. The deed is still in my name. You've been planning to steal what you have no right to, and I will not sit here and let it happen." Peter slammed the paper back down. "You can't be serious, Mom. We're your sons." I leaned forward, meeting his glare without blinking. "And Thomas was my husband. He earned every inch of this home, and you sold his metals for $10. You called his legacy junk. Don't talk to me about family." For the first time, David's eyes softened. "Mom, we were desperate. We needed the money." I shook my head slowly. Desperation doesn't excuse betrayal. You could have come to me. Instead, you went behind my back and tried to take everything. Now you're reaping what you sowed. Peter's jaw worked as he tried to find the right words, but his pride wouldn't let him apologize. Instead, he stood abruptly. "We'll fight this. You think a piece of paper is gonna scare us?" "That piece of paper," I said quietly, "is legally binding. And so is the deed. Go ahead and fight. I've been preparing for this longer than you realize." I watched them storm out of the room, their voices low and angry in the hallway. I knew they wouldn't take this lying down. If anything, this was going to make them even more reckless. And reckless men make mistakes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my bedroom, the eviction notice back in my hands. It felt like a shield, but also a sword. The law was on my side, but I knew my sons. They would try something underhanded before they left. Sure enough, 2 days later, I found signs that someone had been in my room while I was out in the garden. The cedar box where I kept the deed had been moved. The lid was slightly ajar. They were hunting for it, hoping to destroy the only proof I had. I locked it away in a small safe hidden under the floorboards, a safe they didn't know existed. Then I waited. The waiting didn't last long. One rainy evening, I heard the creak of my bedroom door while I was in the kitchen. My footsteps were silent as I moved down the hallway. From the shadows, I saw Peter rifling through my drawers, David standing watch at the door. That was my breaking point. I stepped into the doorway, the light from the hallway spilling over me, and said in the coldest voice I'd ever used, "Looking for something?" Both of them froze like deer caught in headlights. Peter's hand was still inside my drawer, his face pale. David stammered, "Mom, we were just—" "Save it," I said. "Because whatever you were about to do just crossed a line you can't step back from." I reached for the phone on my nightstand. And the person I was about to call would make sure this turned into a fight. They could never win. My hand hovered over the phone for only a second before I pressed the familiar number. It rang twice before a calm but firm voice answered. "Maggie, what's wrong?" It was Mr. Harlan, my lawyer, the one man I knew could turn this ugly mess into a legal nightmare for my sons. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're in my bedroom right now," I said, my voice low but steady. "Going through my things. They've been looking for the deed. I'm done playing nice." He didn't hesitate. "Stay calm. I'll call the sheriff's department. And Maggie, don't let them leave until the deputies arrive." I put the phone down slowly, my eyes never leaving Peter and David. They looked like cornered animals, both tense, waiting for my next move. "Who was that?" Peter demanded. "My lawyer," I said plainly. "And before you start lying, you should know the police are on their way." David's face fell instantly, panic flickering in his eyes. Peter, on the other hand, smirked like he thought I was bluffing. "You're really gonna call the cops on your own kids?" he asked, almost laughing. "I'm not calling the cops on my kids," I corrected. "I'm calling the cops on 2 men who broke into my bedroom and tried to steal legal documents." We stood there in silence, the ticking of the hallway clock filling the air like a countdown. Then came the sound I'd been waiting for, the crunch of tires on the wet gravel outside. Peter's smirk faltered. Within moments, there was a firm knock on the door. I walked past them without a word, opened it, and let in 2 deputies in dark raincoats. One of them, Deputy Cole, was a man Thomas had once mentored when he was just a rookie. He greeted me with a soft nod before stepping inside. "Ma'am, we got a report you needed assistance," he said. "Yes," I replied, pointing toward the hallway. These 2 were in my bedroom without my permission, searching for private legal documents. The deputies separated us, asking each of them questions while I stayed in the living room with Mr. Harlan, who had just arrived, umbrella in hand. He sat beside me and whispered, "If you want to press charges, we can. But I think I have a better idea." I leaned closer. "What's that?" He pulled a thin envelope from his briefcase and slid it across the coffee table. An immediate notice to vacate, backed by a temporary restraining order. If they sign it tonight, they leave tomorrow. If they don't, they leave in handcuffs. I stared at that envelope, the weight of years of hurt pressing down on me. My sons, my own flesh and blood, had brought me to this point. The metal betrayal had been the spark, but this was the fire. The deputies brought Peter and David back into the living room. Their faces were tight, defensive, but there was no more cocky bravado. Mr. Harlan placed the envelope in front of them. "Gentlemen, here's the situation. You can sign this and leave quietly, or you can refuse and spend the night in a holding cell." David swallowed hard. Peter crossed his arms. "You can't kick us out. We're family." I looked him straight in the eye. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't sell their father's legacy for $10. You made your choice. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Peter reached for the pen. My breath caught in my throat, but I wasn't sure if it was relief or sadness. The sound of the pen scratching across paper was the sound of a bridge burning. When it was done, Mr. Harlan gathered the signed documents. You have until noon tomorrow to be gone. Leave the keys on the counter. Peter pushed back from the table without looking at me. David hesitated, his lips parting like he wanted to speak, but he didn't. They both disappeared into the hallway without another word. I sat there, my hands shaking, the reality settling in. Tomorrow, the house would be mine alone again. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't go quietly. And I was right, because the next morning they didn't leave. They barricaded themselves inside. And that was when this turned into something far uglier than I ever imagined. The next morning, I woke to the sound of chairs scraping against the floor upstairs and the slam of doors being locked. For a moment, I thought they were packing. But when I stepped into the hallway, I realized exactly what they were doing, turning my own house into a fortress against me. Every door to the upstairs bedrooms had been barricaded from the inside. Furniture was stacked high against the hallway door. I could hear the muffled sound of Peter and David's voices, low and hurried, like they were plotting their next move. Open this door, I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. This is not going to end well for you. Peter's voice came back, dripping with arrogance. We're not going anywhere until you take that eviction back. This is our house too. I clenched my fists. No, it's not. And you signed the papers last night. That was your last chance to leave quietly. David shouted something I couldn't make out, but I could hear the desperation in his tone. He wasn't as steady in his defiance as Peter. I knew if this came down to a mental tug-of-war, David would break first. But Peter? He would drag his brother down with him before admitting defeat. I didn't want this to escalate, but I also wasn't going to let them run over me again. I went back to my room, took out my phone, and called Mr. Harlan. They've barricaded themselves in, I said, my voice low but steady. He didn't even sound surprised. I'll call the sheriff again. And Maggie, you might want to prepare yourself. This is going to get noisy. Within the hour, 2 patrol cars pulled up outside. Deputy Cole was among them, his jaw set tight. He walked in, took one look at the upstairs hallway, and muttered, "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." They gave Peter and David one last warning through the door. "You've got 30 seconds to open up or we're coming in." From inside, Peter yelled, "You'll have to drag us out." The deputies didn't waste another word. I stepped back as they forced their way in, splintering the door frame with a loud crack. The noise echoed through the house like a gunshot. What happened next was chaos, shouting, the thud of footsteps, and the sound of furniture crashing to the floor. I stayed at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to run up there and scream at them, demand to know how they could do this to their own mother. But another part of me knew it wouldn't change anything. The only thing that would speak loud enough now was consequences. After what felt like forever, the deputies came down with Peter and David in tow. Their wrists weren't cuffed, but their faces were pale, their eyes dark with anger. Peter wouldn't look at me. David did, but the look wasn't remorse. It was something colder. "This isn't over," Peter said quietly as they passed me. I met his gaze for only a second before turning to Deputy Cole. "Make sure they understand they can't set foot on this property again without my permission." Cole nodded. "We'll make it clear." They were escorted out, and the house fell silent. For the first time in months, I could hear the creak of the floors, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the kitchen clock without the constant undercurrent of tension. But the silence didn't bring me peace. It brought a different kind of unease. Because as much as I wanted to believe this was over, I knew my sons. And men who feel cornered often come back swinging. I was right. 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of a car engine idling outside, and when I looked out my window, I saw Peter standing in the dark, staring up at the house. The clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. when I spotted him. Peter stood at the edge of the driveway, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. The only light came from the street lamp, casting his face in half shadow. For a long moment he didn't move, just stared at the house like he was trying to burn holes through the walls. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't turn on the lights. Instead, I stayed by the window, watching. Eventually, he stepped closer, the crunch of his boots on gravel breaking the silence. Then he stopped again, right by the front gate. "Maggie," he called out, his voice low but carrying in the night air. "I just want to talk." I didn't answer. He took another step forward. "You can't just erase us. You can't throw away your own kids like garbage." That word, garbage, twisted something in me. "Like you threw away your father's medals?" I said through the barely cracked window, my voice cutting the cold air. He froze. Then he laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "This isn't over. You think a piece of paper and a few cops are gonna stop me? You owe us, Mom. That house, this land, we grew up here. It's ours too." "No," I said firmly, "it's mine. And your father worked his whole life to make sure of that." Peter's face hardened. He stepped toward the porch, and I could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Not just anger, but desperation. "If you won't give it, I'll take it," he said. I reached for the phone, my fingers wrapping around it like a lifeline. "Leave now, Peter, or you'll regret staying." He smirked, but there was no real confidence in it. "You don't have it in you." That was when I made my choice. I dialed the sheriff's number, my eyes locked on his through the glass. "Sheriff's Department," came Deputy Cole's voice on the other end. "Cole," I said, "he's here." Within 10 minutes, the familiar flash of red and blue lights splashed across the yard. Peter turned to look, his smirk faltering, but he didn't run. 2 deputies stepped out of the car, hands resting near their belts. "Sir, you need to leave the property immediately," one of them said firmly. Peter stood there for a long, tense moment before finally turning and walking back toward the dark street. But as he passed the street lamp, he looked back at me and mouthed the words, "You'll be sorry." The deputies assured me they'd keep a patrol car nearby for the next few nights, but even after they left, sleep didn't come. His threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I knew Peter well enough to believe he meant every word. 3 days later, I found proof. A neighbor stopped by to tell me she'd seen both Peter and David talking to a stranger in a pickup truck at the end of my road. She didn't catch the conversation, but she saw them pointing toward my property. That was when I realized this wasn't just about the house anymore. They were planning something bigger, and I was going to find out exactly what it was, even if it meant catching them in the act. I knew from the start this had to be done quietly. If I confronted them now, they'd just deny everything, and without proof, it would be my word against theirs. No, I needed to see it with my own eyes, and I needed others to see it too. That night, I walked through the house with a small notepad, jotting down every vulnerable spot on the property. The back shed, the garage, the basement door, the old fence by the far side of the yard, places someone could slip in without being seen from the road. I took special note of the basement door. It was tucked behind the shrubs, invisible unless you knew it was there. Thomas used to joke it was the secret entrance. If they were planning something, that would be the place they'd use. The next morning, I called Mr. Harlan and told him my plan. "I'm going to set a trap," I said plainly. There was a pause on the other end. "Maggie, be careful. This could get dangerous." "I'm done being careful," I told him. "I've been careful my whole life. Now I'm going to be smart." By evening, I had installed 2 motion-activated cameras, one by the basement door and another facing the driveway. They were small, easy to miss unless you knew where to look. I also placed a small digital recorder inside the basement, tucked between a stack of paint cans. Then I waited. 2 nights passed with nothing. On the 3rd night, just after 1 a.m., the camera by the basement door sent an alert to my phone. My heart thudded as I opened the live feed. There they were, Peter and David, standing in the shadows, whispering to each other. Peter held a crowbar. David kept glancing around like a man who knew he was doing something wrong. "Let's just do it and get out." David's voice came through the recorder later. Peter's reply was low but clear. "Once we're inside, we find the deed and anything else we can sell. She won't stop us again." I watched as Peter forced the basement door open. My hand hovered over my phone, ready to call the sheriff, but something inside me said to wait. I needed them fully inside. I needed the footage to be undeniable. The feed showed them stepping into the basement, rummaging around. I could hear the clatter of boxes being moved, drawers opening. Then Peter's voice again. Where is it? She hides everything. David's reply made my blood run cold. If we can't find it, we burn the place down. Insurance will cover it. I didn't wait another second. I dialed the sheriff's number with trembling fingers, my voice low but urgent. They're in my basement right now, and I have them on camera. Deputy Cole's voice sharpened. Stay where you are. Lock your bedroom door. We're on our way. I followed his instructions, my back pressed against the door as I listened to the faint thuds and scraping below me. It felt like hours, though it was only minutes, before the sound of sirens cut through the night. The feed showed the deputies arriving, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Peter and David tried to bolt through the basement door, but were met by 2 deputies blocking their escape. The next moments were chaos, shouting, commands to get on the ground, the glint of handcuffs in the beam of a flashlight. They were caught. Finally. But even as they were led away, Peter's head turned toward the camera, and his eyes locked on mine through the lens. The look he gave me wasn't fear. It was a promise. This isn't over. His lips formed silently. And the worst part was, I believed him. Because the next morning I got a phone call that made my blood run cold, a call that told me this fight was about to spill far beyond my property. The call came just after sunrise. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and when I saw the name, my stomach tightened. It was Deputy Cole. Maggie, he said without preamble. I thought you should know. Your sons made bail last night. And from what we've heard, they've been telling anyone who will listen that they're coming back for the house. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Can they legally come here? They're under a no-contact order, Cole said. But Maggie, men like this don't always care about court orders. Keep your doors locked. We'll have patrols swing by more often. After I hung up, I walked slowly to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window looking out at the frost-covered yard. My heart was steady. I'd been living with their threats for months. But this time, I wasn't just going to wait. This time, I was going to end it. I called Mr. Harlan. It's time, I said simply. He knew exactly what I meant. We had discussed this scenario weeks ago, the one move that would cut off any leverage Peter and David thought they still had. That afternoon, we met at his office. On the table was a thick stack of documents. This, he said, tapping the top page, transfers full ownership of the property to a trust in your name only, with strict legal protections. If they so much as step foot here without permission, they'll be arrested on the spot. I signed every page, my signature neat and deliberate. Each stroke of the pen felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they had tried to take. When it was done, Mr. Harlan smiled faintly. It's ironclad now, Maggie. They can't touch you. But I wasn't finished. I want them to know it's over. Publicly. That evening I called the local paper. The reporter who answered had covered my husband's funeral years ago. She remembered the medals, remembered Thomas. I told her everything. The betrayal, the theft, the eviction, the attempted break-in. And now, the trust that sealed the property in my name forever. 2 days later, my story was on the front page under the headline, War Hero's Widow Defends Home Against Her Own Sons. The article made its way around town, and the calls started pouring in. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years came by to offer support. Strangers sent letters. And more importantly, the shame of that headline stuck to Peter and David like tar. A week later, they showed up, not at my house, but in the parking lot of the diner where I was having lunch. I saw them before they saw me. Peter's face was tight with anger, David's with something closer to shame. Peter walked up to my table. You think you've won, he said in a low voice. I put down my coffee and looked him dead in the eye. No, Peter. I know I've won. And I know you've lost. Not just the house, but my trust, my respect, and any place in my life. David didn't meet my gaze. He muttered, I'm sorry, Mom. But the words felt thin, almost like they belonged to someone else. Peter leaned closer, his voice almost a whisper. This isn't over. I smiled faintly. It is for me. Then I turned back to my meal. They left without another word. And for the first time in months, I felt the air around me lighten. When I got home that night, I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me. I walked into the living room, sat in my favorite chair, and looked at the empty space where Thomas's medals had once been. I would never get them back, at least not the physical pieces. But I realized something important. The medals were a symbol of honor, sacrifice, and resilience. And in my own way, by standing my ground, I had honored Thomas's legacy more than any glass case ever could. Sometimes, family will hurt you in ways strangers never could. But blood doesn't excuse betrayal, and love doesn't mean allowing someone to destroy you. I learned that standing up for myself didn't mean I was losing my family. It meant I was protecting the part of myself that they couldn't take. And as I locked the door behind me that night, I knew one thing for certain. They would never, ever call their father's legacy junk again. To everyone listening, if this story has taught you anything, let it be this: your dignity is worth defending, no matter who tries to take it. If you believe in protecting what's yours and standing your ground, like, comment, and subscribe. And tell me, if it had been you, would you have forgiven them, or closed the door for good?